Hey everybody, this is Nick on Control Nick, and today we're going to figure out if you can save some money at home by following this personal budget that I've got set up for us. Please download the link that I have in the description of the video so that you can use the same exact workbook. Let's go into the workbook now so I can show you exactly what we can do. Okay, so now we're in the Excel workbook. Now, what we're looking at here are a few different rows and items that we're going to be filling in and a couple different columns where we're going to be tracking, are we hitting our goals in terms of savings or revenue performance? You can see we have the top section is the net take-home pay. It's essentially just when you look at your pay slip, whether you get paid bi-weekly or monthly, you just want to make sure you add in whatever time interval that you want to work with in the workbook. Now in here, I've set it up as monthly budget. So if you are getting paid bi-weekly, just round up to the month and then use that number for how much you're getting paid monthly and add it into the yellow cells. You'll notice I have yellow cells filled out all throughout this workbook. These are the only cells that you would actually need to fill in. Everything else is already created as a formula for you, and they're simple formulas. It's just showing differences. So in column E, it's just the actual minus the goal column, or you have different subtotal columns, which it's just summing the yellow cells that you have above. But generally, all these different categories I have in here should cover the majority of your expenses that you might be encountering on a monthly basis. So as you'll notice, I have it categorized by primary expenses, which is if you have a rent or mortgage payment that you're doing monthly, or sometimes you might be doing quarterly, but average it to what is that per month that you would typically experience. You have your utilities, which is heat, water, electricity. Any insurances you might be paying per month. That could be your auto insurance, that could be health insurance, anything of the like. Any credit card payments. Now, you might be fluctuating in credit card payments. That's why it's good to have a goal of what you think you want to hit. Maybe you know that you like to spend and do some online shopping, but you've been doing it a little too much. This is a good way to track how much you're actually doing on average per month. And then it's always advised to put in any extra medical expenses that you might be having to pay on a monthly basis. Could be anything of subscriptions, or if you have recently gone to the hospital for illness, whatever it might be, maybe take a look into how much is that costing you, because it all adds up at the end of the day, right? The next section is additional living expenses. So it's not things that are as primary and urgent. So it would be gas or transport, using your phone, whether it's adding on minutes or data, or if it's just a general subscription, or you're paying off your phone. Internet cost, your monthly groceries. Again, you don't need to add up all your groceries, but it could just be a general estimate that you believe you're putting in. But it doesn't hurt to maybe sum it up for the last month or two just to see. And then other, anything else you believe for your personal workbook that you think needs to be added into the additional living expenses that isn't already shown here. Lastly, we then have variable expenses. This is technically the luxury expenses, or what you would do with your disposable income after all of the necessities are being paid. So for example, subscriptions could be to Netflix or HBO, anything where you are paying monthly to have an additional benefit that's not an actual need. Eating out, yeah, that's just eating out at restaurants. Entertainment would be the same thing, going to like sporting events, anything of that like. Online shopping is typically a common one. And then other, if you want to put in anything extra that you're doing normally, that's considered as part of a variable expense. Then at the very bottom, you have a couple key formulas. So the first one is total expenses, and you'll notice that's just summing together all of these expenses into one. And then you have remaining, which is your net take-home pay less the total expenses. And at the very end, based off of those last two rows, you then have a percent of net take-home pay, which is what percent am I left with after reducing out all these different expenses? It's a very quick exercise, and if you don't feel comfortable filling in this workbook right away, that should actually be a flag for you to already raise for yourself, saying, well, maybe I should actually take a closer look at what am I actually having at the end of the day? Because that percent of net take-home pay, typically around 20 to 30%, 30 to 40% is very good, 20 to 30 is pretty normal. Anything lower than that, that's where I would actually suggest you take a look at where you may be spending too much. And typically that is in variable expenses, and especially in subscriptions where we forget how much we're paying monthly for these different services. Let me show you how this works. We'll just go through an example here. So if you don't have a goal, Let's just start with actuals. So let's say you look at your payslip and you earn at the end of the day 3,000 in your payslip. Let's say your rent per month, which is typically the largest chunk of what you're paying each month, let's say that is $1,100. Now let's put in utilities. Let's assume heat, maybe that's 50 per month. Again, this will fluctuate based off of seasonality, but put in what you think makes sense. Water, same thing, $50. And let's do electricity, let's do 75. Again, these are just high level estimates here. Then for insurances, this also typically adds up, especially if you have auto insurance that you're paying. So let's assume I have some auto insurance, I have home insurance, health insurance, things of that nature. Let's assume it's around 250 per month, give or take. Now we have credit card payments. That could be anything. That's completely up to you of however you're living your life. But let's assume that for credit card payments, it's around $100 per month. Who knows? And then medical expenses, it's the same thing where it's, of course, dependent on your living situation. Let's assume it's 50. Again, for some it's going to be very high, for some will be lower or almost zero. Just depends on the person, right? That totals out to $1,675 of primary expenses. And as you'll notice actually is at the bottom, your total expenses is already adding up. Same with how much is remaining. So of the 3,000 of your pay slip, you have $1,325 remaining, which is 44% net take-home pay. So it's already eating a large chunk based off of all these different payments that are going in. And that's why I think it's so critical to really look at your living expenses and your variable expenses. Even things like groceries, where if you feel like you are squeezed, maybe it makes sense that you go and find the deals in the grocery stores rather than always buying luxury. But of course, it's up to you what you want to change in your living situation, right? Let's keep going through just to see how this ends up. Gas or transport, let's assume it's gas, and let's assume around $50 a month. For phone, let's assume again $50, and internet, we'll do the same thing, keeping it very simple. Now for groceries, again, that's going to be very variable, very dependent on the person. Let's assume it's going to be around $150 per month. And then last thing is other, we'll leave that blank for now. What you'll notice, and I think is important to check, is once you've filled in both primary expenses and additional living expenses, take a look at your percent of net take-home pay. Again, the normal range is 20 to 30%, and 30% plus is very, very strong. But once you start going below that 20 to 30% range, especially if it starts hitting the lower 20s, that's where I'd really advise you start taking a look at, are these things that I really need? Because although you have all these expenses and maybe you're enjoying everything that you're paying for, you still, of course, want to put something aside so that you have a savings at the end of the day, especially a safety savings that you can use in case of emergency, or AKA an emergency fund. Let's say for subscriptions, which I would say is something very common that people have nowadays, let's say that's around $75 a month. Now, if you also have a cable subscription, for example, that's very expensive, and they will keep raising that price unknowingly sometimes. And that can be $100 alone just for cable channels. So maybe take a look at that as well. And you know what? Let's make that 75, 120 instead, just in case. Eating out, even if you're only eating out 3 to 4 times a month, that also adds up. If it's $50 every time you eat out, especially in today's environment, that's going to be around $150 to $200 a month. So let's do 150. Let's assume 3 times a month. Then you have entertainment. Again, entertainment can be a lot of things. It could even be buying video games for your console. Let's just assume video games is not too high. Let's say 50 a month, depending on whatever it is that you get. And then there's online shopping, which of course affects a lot of people today. It affects myself as well. Let's assume that it fluctuates month to month. Use an average if you think that sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. Of course, you also have times of the year where you spend a lot more on online shopping, like the Christmas period. So I would use just your typical average month and then go from there. You can always adjust this if you'd like. So we'll use 75 for that per month. And then you have other. Again, it depends on what you would like to put into that category. But as you can see, as I was putting in variable expenses, it starts to eat away really at net take-home pay percentage. Now, we're already at 21% based off of this. There could be a lot of money going towards these other categories as well. So really just keep that in mind. And once you have your actuals laid out, it's really important to have a goal. So let's put in same net take home pay of 3,000. So there's no difference there between your goal and your actual. That's just your reality, right? And I would say it's also a same thing for a lot of these primary expenses because most often these are fixed. Your rent is typically fixed or your mortgage payments. Same thing for heat, for water and electricity. Again, those will fluctuate slightly per month, but it's really dependent on, how cold are you, of course, or what you need to spend on. So it's really hard to reduce those, of course, unless you want to find a different provider, for example. Insurances, that's where you could look around a little bit. Maybe you're paying $250 a month, but you want to look for a different car insurance provider. So maybe you can find it at $225. Credit card payments, that could be based off of previous online shopping expenses that you're trying to pay off. Maybe you want to get that down to $70 a month rather than $100. Lastly, for medical expenses, that one I would say is also tough. Let's keep that at 50. Now we're in the additional living expenses. Again, gas and transport, pretty tough. We'll have to leave it at that most likely. Same thing with phone and internet. Again, you can always search for new providers, but typically I would assume you're always looking for the one that is the most affordable. Groceries is one where you really can have an impact. Now, 150 is questionably low for some people. For myself, I would say that's a fair range to have. But then let's say that you want to find a cheaper option or alternative, or just go to a different store that you know is cheaper. Maybe it's not as good as quality, but if you're trying to find that extra savings, maybe you can do so by going somewhere else. So you can bring that to 125 per month. Now we go to the variable expenses. So you have subscriptions. This is one where I would advise really taking a look throughout your account to figure out what are you subscribed to, because there are so many hidden fees. $120 a month for subscriptions, I would say is very high, but for the average person, it might not be because we're just not aware of what's going on in our day-to-day expenses. My suggestion would be to lower that, and I would put that at $40. Eating out, that's the same thing. Now, you can eat out in cheaper alternatives. It doesn't have to be as extravagant. It doesn't have to be $50 every time you go out. But again, it's up to you. If you want to find some extra savings, then put it there. Entertainment, it's the same thing. So we'll just keep putting in, let's say entertainment, you're very happy with what you're doing. That is your hobby, for example. Let's keep it at 50. And online shopping, let's put that at a little bit lower because there's been a little too much online shopping. Once you have that in, you can see where you're completely over in this workbook. So especially in subscriptions, we are way higher than the goal that we would like to have. And at the same time, you can see where all the red indicators actually are. As you update this file, the reds will hopefully switch over to greens. And of course, it depends on how often you fill in this workbook, whether it's once a month or maybe it's only twice a year. But if you get subscriptions, let's say down to your actual being 30, you'll notice you finally have a savings in there. So it's a nice and easy way to actually track this. And the most important part is figuring out what is my percent of net take home pay. Your goal is 29%. I would say even if you can get it up another percent or two, that would be ideal. Get within 30, 40, use this percentage as your goal tracker. But 29% is also completely fine. And you can see how much more wiggle room you actually have. And you're actually earning, based off of achieving this goal, an extra $225 a month. It's a simple exercise. It might take some time if you're not used to looking at your finances, but it's a good reality check just to make sure you're in a comfortable position. So now that you actually have everything filled in, you want to make sure you start logging as you look through your expenses, and that's where the comment category comes in column G. Let's say, for example, you really want to take a closer look at your subscriptions. You filled in 120, but it's really good to understand where does 120 come from. So I would suggest putting in things like, if you have a Netflix subscription, you put Netflix, say you put it in as 15 per month, like that. Maybe you have HBO as well, and that's also 15. And then you have cable company or cable, and then that's probably, let's say, 75 per month. A lot of people also have Disney Plus, right? So you can start logging all of these different commentary into here, and then it's also a real clear way for you to say, ooh, maybe I don't need to have these 3 different channels, especially if you reflect and feel like you only use Netflix, you never use HBO or Disney Plus anyway, or maybe you realize, well, cable is more than all of these subscriptions combined. So maybe I don't need to have cable anymore. Maybe I can look at a different provider. Make sure to log in the comments section. That also really helps you get a more clear picture of where you overspending. That was it for today. Let me know in the comments if you saved any money, and consider subscribing if you found this video useful, or selecting either the videos that are popping up above here. Thanks again and have an amazing day.